All right, so today we're going to look at behavioral and social learning, specifically Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment. My name is Bobby Bacon, and this is for Foundation of Education 1. So classical conditioning. What do you think of when you hear this phrase? Go ahead and take a second to think about it. So my initial thought, when I started thinking about how I might define classical conditioning, would be gradually trying to teach something or someone to do something or act in a particular way. I started thinking about my 2.5-year-old nephew, and his parents are trying to teach him to share his toys and play nicely with other children. That's not something that you just tell him once and he does it thereafter. It's a process. It involves a lot of discipline and rewards. So it's definitely that trying to teach that learned behavior, which is kind of what I initially thought of when I started thinking about classical conditioning. But anytime that I am trying to teach myself a concept or refresh myself on something, I always go back to that method that we all learned in elementary school of looking at things in the concept of who, what, where, when, why, and how. So that's the approach that we're going to take today. So starting out with who, Ivan Pavlov. He was born September 14th, 1849 in Ryazan, Russia. He died February 27th, 1936 in Leningrad, Russia. He was a physiologist. He was a Nobel Prize winner in 1904 in recognition for his work on digestion. And he was the first person to investigate classical conditioning variables. Moving on to the what. What is classical conditioning? It's also called Pavlovian conditioning, courtesy of all of Pavlov's work on the issue. So think back to what you thought of earlier. The technical definition is a type of learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus becomes paired or associated with a stimulus that causes a reflexive behavior and eventually becomes sufficient to produce that behavior. So now on to the where. Pavlov did most of his scientific work on digestion at the Institute of Experimental Medicine in St. Petersburg, Russia. He spent about 46 years there, and the physiology department was named after him. When? He did most of his work on digestion between the years of 1891 and 1900. This specific experiment that we're going to look at today was sometime between the years of 1891 and 1895. So why? Why did he decide to look at classical conditioning and try and figure this out? Well, it was an accident. During his studies on digestion, he studied salivation in dogs. Salivation is a big part of the digestion process. It's the initial point of breaking down the food and processing it as we chew. So he worked a lot in the salivation aspect and used dogs for that. And he noticed that as he was studying them, as soon as they saw their food bowl, they started to salivate. And that led him to the classical conditioning experiment. So before we move on to the how, we're going to go over a few definitions that are important to understand for the rest of the experiment. There are 4 main terms. First one is unconditioned stimulus, or US, a stimulus that elicits an automatic response, UR, without requiring prior learning. Unconditioned response, or UR, the reflexive response elicited by a particular stimulus. So for this, you could think of when you go to the doctor and he or she hits your knee and your leg kicks. That's that reflexive, unlearned reaction That would be like that unconditioned response. The next one is conditioned stimulus, CS, an originally neutral stimulus that acquires significance through pairings with an unconditioned stimulus. And conditioned response, CR, a response that depends or is conditional on pairings of the conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. Once learned, the conditioned response occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented alone. And that gets a little bit wordy. Quite a few of those definitions are a little wordy. It'll make more sense as we go on actually through the experiment and you see how it actually plays out. So now on to the how. Pavlov had a few tools for his experiment. Obviously, he had some dogs and some dog food. And then he also used a tuning fork. When you ring the tuning fork, it makes a ringing noise in a specific tone. And he used that as his conditioned stimulus throughout the experiment. And there were 3 phases to his experiment. First phase, prior to conditioning. Phase 2, during conditioning. And phase 3, after conditioning. So phase 1, prior to conditioning, Pavlov would sound the tuning fork and there would be no reaction. So at this point, the tuning fork was just a neutral stimulus. The dogs probably heard it and just kept doing whatever they were doing. It didn't mean anything to them at this point. Pavlov already knew that seeing their food bowl caused the dogs to salivate. That's what kind of got him into this experiment. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation is the unconditioned response. And here's the little animation of it. The food causes the salivation. Those are the unconditioned, unlearned. You don't ever have to learn that. You just know when the dog sees food, it's going to salivate, kind of like the rest of us do. Before conditioning, you go over to the tuning fork, nothing happens. That's just a neutral stimulus. It doesn't signal anything to the dog. So now into phase 2, during conditioning. Pavlov sounds the tuning fork immediately before presenting the dogs their food. That's very important to keep in mind, that he sounded the tuning fork immediately before the dogs got their food. So it paired the tuning fork, which becomes now the conditioned stimulus, to the US, the unconditioned stimulus, the food. So the dogs salivate, which is a UR, an unconditioned response. Especially in the beginning of the experiment, the tuning fork still didn't mean anything to the dogs. It was an unconditioned stimulus of food and an unconditioned response of the dogs salivating. However, obviously, as they heard the sound of the tuning fork more and more right before they got their food, the dogs would learn that hearing that sound means that food is on the way. So that's the during conditioning process. They hear the sound of the tuning fork and then immediately after get the food, and they've got that salivation, which for the majority of the process of the conditioning is still an unconditioned response. But by the end, after conditioning, phase 3, the dogs began to associate the tone, the conditioned stimulus, with the food, the unconditioned stimulus, which means that Pavlov was able to ring the tuning fork and the dogs would salivate without ever having the food available. So now that becomes a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus. So the dogs were salivating without ever seeing the food because they were connecting the fact that the tuning fork, the sound of the tuning fork, meant that food was on its way, which was the conditioned stimulus. So notice that here in phase 3, the salivation has actually changed from an unconditioned response to a conditioned response when they are reacting to the tuning fork alone. And there's that picture. So Pavlov did check some other variations, as with all of his experiments, and anytime we ever do experiments in life, you always want to make sure that you're right and you've got it the only way that it's supposed to be done. So he checked backward conditioning and also simultaneous conditioning. Forward conditioning, which is the only one that had not previously been mentioned, was what the experiment actually was. It was the food, the unconditioned stimulus, immediately following the conditioned stimulus, the tuning fork. So, like I said, to remember, the tuning fork always came immediately right before the food. So the dogs learned that as soon as they heard the sound, that food was on its way. So that was forward conditioning. When he tested the backward conditioning, which is the reverse of that, the food was given to the dogs, and then right after they were given the food, the conditioned stimulus, the tuning fork, was sounded. And there was never an association that way. And then simultaneous conditioning presented both the food and the tuning fork at the same time. And there was never an association that way either. I will say that since Pavlov's studies, scientists have gone and worked with the backward conditioning, and especially with humans, they have found ways to have backward conditioning that actually does work. But for the dogs and for this technical experiment, the backward conditioning did not create any associations. So what is our takeaway from this? A little something to think about. How can we take his experiment generally, because we can't exactly experiment on our students with food and tuning forks, but overall, the overall concept, how can we apply that to our classrooms? So the way I think about it, it could be used in everyday routines or even some discipline structures. So that's definitely something for you to think about as to how we can kind of generally use this concept to help us in our classrooms.